Hey, I'm Erin with Body of Light Studio, and today we're going to talk about diastasis recti, which is separation of the linea alba of the abdominal muscles. Katie Aspen with Modern Living Real Estate in Dallas, Texas, sent a request for a video on healing her herniated belly button that she developed during her first pregnancy. So let's take a look at some of our core musculature. We'll look at Anatomy of Movement, one of my favorite reference books. And the first core muscle that we will talk about is the diaphragm. So here you'll see the respiratory diaphragm in the rib cage, and in its resting position at the end of the exhale, it's domed up into the rib cage. Here we're looking at the diaphragm from underneath, so from up underneath the rib cage, and you can see it attaches down the front of the spine, around the inside of the rib cage, and then there's holes in the diaphragm for like the esophagus, the aorta to go through. And then the next thing we'll look at is the transverse abdominis. So we will talk a lot about the transverse abdominis today. Attaches to the rib cage at the top, the pelvis at the bottom, the spine and the rib cage and the pelvis at the back of the body. So here's half of the transverse abdominis, and then again half of the transverse abdominis, and you can see the action. So as you inhale, the transverse abdominis moves out, and as you exhale, it draws in. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we're seated. Let's look at the pelvic floor, another of our core muscles. So here we're looking at the pelvic inlet. So from the top of the pelvis looking down into the pelvic outlet, which is the bottom of the pelvis. And you can see the muscles of the pelvic floor. And here we're looking, this is the tailbone and the sacrum. We're looking at the pelvic floor from like the back underneath. You can see it's like a dome. It's also a diaphragm. People also call it the pelvic diaphragm, kind of like a trampoline group of muscles that closes off the pelvic outlet, the space between the sitting bones and the tailbone and the pubic symphysis in the front. And lastly, well, actually we have two more images to look at. Here we have the rectus abdominis. So this is what people think about as their six-pack abs. Here you can see it's like an 8-pack. This is the most superficial layer of abdominal muscle that we have. And this muscle, this line down the center, this linea alba, is where we see the diastasis recti happen. So let's look at an image of diastasis recti on my phone. So here we would see like a normal, typical abdominal wall. And then here's a diastasis recti around the belly button. It's just a spreading, like a widening of that linea alba. And then there in the second image, that's more at the top of the rectus abdominis. In this third image, you can see the diastasis below the navel. And then here's one around the navel. So this one's actually like a widening of the entire linea alba. And then this one's more around the navel, which is what Katie is referring to has happened in her own body. So let's take a seat and get started with our exercise. We'll start seated on a ball. If you don't have a ball to use, you can use a block. A soccer ball can work. I really like a Pilates ball because it's got some softness to it. But if all you have is a soccer ball, that's great. The size of a soccer ball is nice. A basketball is a little too hard. We'll sit in Virasana. That means that the ball is under your pelvis, so it's at the pelvic outlet. Your knees are together, your feet are outside of your hips. If you do not have a ball, a yoga block will be just fine for this. I like the ball because it forms to the shape of your pelvic outlet, and you can really sense your pelvic floor while you're sitting here. So adjust your glutes back and wide out to the sides. Take the undersides of your knees and lengthen them forward and rest your hands in your lap. Let's talk about our pelvis here. So identify your ACES, they're the hip points at the top front of the pelvis, and your pubic symphysis, or the pubic bone at the bottom front of your pelvis. And we want to be seated in a neutral pelvis position. I'll turn to the side so you can see what I'm talking about. If you are in an anterior tilt, that means your ACES are in front of your pubis. So you'd be kind of like sticking your butt out If you're in a posterior tilt, it means your pubis is in front of the asis and you're tucking your tail. Seated, that would be behind the sitting bones. So we want to be right in the middle of the sitting bones in a neutral pelvis so that your pubic symphysis and your asis are in one flat plane parallel to the wall that you're facing. And let's go from the ground up with our pelvic or with our core musculature. So your pelvic floor, if you're seated on that ball, you can feel the pelvic floor. Go ahead and lift your pelvic floor up. And that's the sensation of like when you're peeing and you stop peeing in the middle of going to the bathroom. If you're a man and you're doing this video, this core work is just as important and effective for men as it is for women. This is a little bit vulgar, but if you were to take like a match or a lighter and light it underneath your testicles, imagine how you would lift the testicles up. That's your pelvic floor engaging. All right, so let's move on from there and let's talk about the transverse abdominis. Again, I'll turn to the side for this one. As you inhale, the transverse abdominis expands, and as you exhale, it draws in. You can see the abdominal wall flattens. You inhale to release it, and you exhale to bring the abdomen in, to bring the abdominal wall back towards the spine. Let's do that one more time. Inhale, expanding the abdominal wall, letting it release forward. Exhale, abdominal wall draws back. Okay, diaphragm. So diaphragm right around the opening of the rib cage. In its resting position, it's releasing up like a parachute. And as you inhale, it moves down, it flattens and widens. And on your exhale, whoosh, it releases up. So if you watch a jellyfish swimming in the ocean, it's got that like doming and flattening movement. That's the same movement of the diaphragm. And I really like the image of the parachute when it catches the air, how it whoosh, releases up. That's the diaphragm on the exhale. So let's just sit for a couple moments here and breathe. You're going to inhale, allowing the abdominal wall to release forward, feeling the diaphragm dome down. And as you exhale, you're going to draw the abdominal wall in towards the spine and feel the diaphragm release up. Inhale, abdominal wall moves forward, the rib cage expands forward and back, side to side. Exhale, the abdominal wall draws in, the ribs release down and in. Inhale, abdominal wall moves forward. Exhale, abdominal wall moves back. Inhale, the ribs open wide out and up. Exhale, they release down and in. One more breath, thinking about the transverse abdominis expanding as you inhale, the ribs opening as you inhale. Exhale, the abdominal wall moves back. Ribs release in. Okay, we're gonna add the engagement of the pelvic floor. So let's take a breath in. Exhale, engage your pelvic floor. So you lift the vaginal walls so the testicles draw up. Inhale, abdominal wall expands, the pelvic floor spreads out wide on your ball. Exhale, lift the pelvic floor. It's like you're stopping the flow of urine while you're peeing. Inhale, pelvic floor spreads and releases. Exhale, lift your pelvic floor. Feel how that helps to lift and draw in the low fibers of the transverse abdominis. Inhale, pelvic floor expands, it spreads. Exhale, lift your pelvic floor, abdominal wall draws in. Keep breathing like that. And while you breathe here, notice, are you on your exhale giving more like a bearing down with your breath? Are your ribs pushing in? The ribs release in, but it's an effortless release. The exhale should feel really light and your spine should actually lift a little bit taller. If you feel like a on the exhale, you're probably using your oblique muscles to work your exhale, and that's going to actually create a further separation in the linea alba, and that will worsen your diastasis recti. So the key to the breath work for this core, this deep core engagement, is to actually do less work. So let's take about 30 more seconds, one more minute here. Inhaling, Everything releases and opens. Exhale, lift your pelvic floor. The navel moves back and up. Inhale, pelvic floor spreads. Exhale, engage your pelvic floor. The navel draws in and up as the diaphragm releases up. One more breath like that. Inhale, expanding the pelvic floor. Exhale, pelvic floor draws up. Navel moves back and up. All right, from here, let's come onto the hands and the knees, and you'll put your ball between your knees or your block and find a neutral pelvis here. So now if you're tucking, your pubic bone will be higher away from the ground than your pubic bone will be lower than your ASIS. So we want to slide the pubic bone back, the sitting bones lift and open, and it's like you could balance a martini glass on your sacrum, right on the small of the back, and it's not going to fall off. You're going to take an inhale, release the abdomen. Exhale, abdominal wall draws in, you engage the pelvic floor. Inhale, abdomen expands. Exhale, engage your pelvic floor, draw the navel in. Keep going like that. As you breathe, the belly expands, almost like a pregnant cat sensation. Exhale, navel draws in, pelvic floor engages. Good, you're gonna keep breathing like that. You wanna push through the ground with your arms. So you're not letting your ribs collapse down into the floor. You're pressing your ring fingers firmly down, pointer finger, knuckle down, and you're floating your rib cage up into your scapula. You're really rooting from your outer scapula down into your ring fingers. And then notice when you do this, do you round the back? See if you can lengthen the heart forward, lengthen the crown of the head away from your tail. Keep the tail slightly perking up towards the ceiling. Let's do 3 more breaths here. Inhale, expanding the abdomen. Exhale, navel draws in, pelvic floor engages, spine grows longer from crown of the head to tail. Inhale, expand the abdomen, let the navel release towards the ground. Exhale, pelvic floor, navel draws in. One more. Inhale, abdomen releases, ribs widen. Exhale, pelvic floor draws up, navel draws in. Okay, we're gonna stay here. Tuck your toes. We're only gonna do one more exercise in this first video for Diastasis Recti. You're gonna take an inhale, and on your exhale, lift your pelvic floor, draw the navel in, squeeze your ball or your block between your knees, and pick your knees up off the ground. You're just gonna hover, don't lift too high. Notice when you hover, did you tuck your tail? Did you stick your butt out too much? You wanna keep that neutral pelvis. Tap the knees down, take an inhale. Exhale, engage your pelvic floor, draw the navel in, squeeze the ball, and hover the knees. Keep going like that. Inhale, the knees release down. Exhale, pelvic floor lifts, navel draws in, spine lengthens, squeeze the ball and hover. Okay, keep going. I'm going to talk to you about this as you continue to move. Your triceps, the backs of your arms, should be spiraling back towards your legs. You're still rooting from your outer scapula down into your ring fingers so that the rib cage is floating up into your scapula, your shoulder blades. You're not tucking the tail towards the ground. You're not overextending in the lumbar or sacrum. You're keeping that nice neutral pelvis. Do about 3 or 4 more, and as you do this, look down at your abdomen and see, are you doming? Is your abdominal wall doming out through that linea alba? If it is, maybe cut back on the hovers and just continue to work the core with your knees on the ground. Remember that the abdominal wall goes all the way up to the rib cage, all the way down to the pelvis. You want to think about that full engagement from the bottom of the ribs all the way down to the pelvis. Let's do like 2 or 3 more. Inhale. Exhale, pelvic floor, TBA, squeeze the ball, hover the knees, your triceps are rotating back, you're growing longer from tail to head. Last one. Inhale into release. Exhale to hover. You're going to stay here. Shift your pelvis a little bit back. You're pressing your hands forward And then shift way forward like you're peeking over the edge of the cliff. Keep the abdominal wall lifted. Inhale to go back. Exhale, engage your pelvic floor. Draw the navel in. Go way forward. Let's do that 2 more times. Inhale, you can look down at your abdomen. You can see, are you tucking? Is your abdominal wall doming out as you come forward? You want to keep the abdominal wall drawing up into the spine. The front ribs narrowing. Come back to neutral. Take an inhale as you lower the knees down. Big toes together, knees wide. Sit back into a child's pose. If your head doesn't reach the floor, you can rest your head on your ball. Have your knees as wide as your shoulders. Big toes together and press your hands down and forward to move your sitting bones back towards your heels. Feel your rib cage widen out into your legs. As you inhale, the ribs spread out and widen into the thighs. Let your arms release. Bring your hands onto the ground under your shoulders. Starting from your tailbone, start to roll down. So the pubic bone lifts, the tail tucks. You roll up 1 vertebra at a time, stacking the spine from the bottom to the top. And you'll rest your hands on your thighs, gaze straight ahead, and breathe. Okay, that's it for part 1 of our Diastasis Recti exercise series. Thanks for joining.